with the French accent, but my family anglicized that name. So I'm Dr. Tim Langell. I'm a lecturer in Jewish studies, religious studies, and history at ASU. I'm excited about this graduate panel here because we have here graduate students from ASU, U of A, and NAU, which I'll be making an announcement at the end of this session about the future of Genocide Awareness Week, which is going to bring together these three universities. So the format of what's going to happen is I'm going to introduce the four speakers in the order in which they are speaking, and then they're going to present, and we'll have in that order, and then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. Each presentation will be approximately 10 to 12 minutes. So our first speaker will be Claudia Eldib. Her paper is Propaganda and Technology in Rwanda. Claudia is a PhD candidate in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies that we affectionately call SHIPPers at ASU. She studies the role of technology and propaganda play in genocide and how innovations in communication and communication technology and propaganda have shaped the character of modern genocide. Her dissertation focuses on the 1994 Rwandan genocide and argues that innovations in technology and propaganda, such as radio, can work as accelerants for greater participation by civilians in genocide. She'll speak about her research during today's presentation. Our second presenter is Christopher Harrison of NAU, also known as Northern Arizona University, and my favorite place to get away from Phoenix in the heat, Flagstaff, Arizona. He will be his presentation will be the mechanisms of genocidal conscription. Originally from the British Isles, Christopher is an advanced PhD student in political science. He is due to complete his doctorate in April 2021. Congratulations, sir. He teaches political science courses at NAU and history classes at ASU. His research focuses on political connections of warfare, genocide, and conscription in historical and contemporary cases. In his dissertation, Genocidal Conscription, Harrison contributes a theory that explains how states have utilized institutional military service to commit genocide against targeted draftees that died under the guise of war. Our third presentation from down the road from me, down at our I-10 here to Tucson, Arizona. Sina, I don't want to mispronounce your last name. I know you told me. Correct me if I'm wrong. Meisgeier. And her presentation is Hegemonic Relationships, Female Characters in German Memoirs about Ravensbrück concentration camp. Sina is a PhD candidate in a binational program, transnational German studies at University of Arizona and the University of Leipzig in Germany. She has a PhD minor in gender and women's studies, and her dissertation focuses on Holocaust literature written by women about the Ravensbrück concentration camp. She also is interested in exploring anti-fascist narratives surrounding Ravensbrück in former East Germany. Sina has an MA in German studies from Leipzig University and is passionate about teaching German literature, language, and culture. This semester, she's teaching what sounds like a fascinating course, a gen ed class about fascism and resistance. In her presentation today, she will be speaking about her dissertation work as well. And finally, we will close with another ASU graduate student, Mark Vance, who's looking at his presentation will be Rescue of Jews in Vichy, France. Mark is a graduate student at ASU. Mark has researched World War II and the Holocaust, receiving his MA from ASU in 2020 with his thesis focusing on Laus, a family of Holocaust survivors in France, tracing the story of migration, identity, rescue, resistance, resilience through the lens of this family. In his time as a student, Mark has taken part in museum exhibits with local Jewish organizations, several lectures on the family in Arizona across the United States. As a PhD student, Mark hopes to continue his research with the same framework of World War II and the Holocaust, focusing on stories of Jewish rescue and occupational resistance during the war. So here are our four outstanding graduate students. I'm going to silence myself and turn the floor over to our first speaker, Claudia.
Thank you, Dr. Langille, for the introduction, and thank you actually to the Genocide Awareness Week Committee for the opportunity to present my research here. Full disclosure, this is my first academic conference, certainly first virtual, so pardon in advance any eye movements or ums or anything of this nature, and I will simply relax and begin to present my research. So I study the role of propaganda and technology in genocide, and how technological innovations, particularly those in communications, have reshaped the conduct of genocide. Using the Rwandan genocide as my case in point, I will present my thesis, which is genocide has historically been a top-down event that is planned, controlled, and conducted by a central authority. Modern genocide, however, has hybridized into a co-produced affair whereby the state enjoins its citizens in the act of committing mass murder. I argue that the genocide project in the modern era requires propaganda and technology to produce the scale of atrocity that defines genocide. I further contend that the ubiquity of powerful mobile devices and the proliferation of social networks serve potentially to empower independent non-state actors and confer greater capability, flexibility, and anonymity to carry out their own targeted mass killings or supplement the genocide plans of others. Why Rwanda? In 1994, in roughly 100 days, the Rwandan Hutu power government led a genocide of over 1 million Rwandans, mostly Tutsis. It was, according to Samantha Powers, a former US ambassador to the UN, the fastest, most efficient killing spree of the 20th century. The spark that kicked off the genocidal killing spree began on April 6, when a plane carrying presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down. The Rwandan Hutu-dominated government at the time enjoined the military and a youth military movement known as Interahamwe, and they launched a massive operation to exterminate every single Tutsi in Rwanda. From April to July, average Hutu citizens consisting of professionals, farmers, priests, and peasants heeded commands issued by the government and announced on supportive radio stations to do their part and slaughter any Tutsi in their midst. In response to such commands, average Hutu unfortunately picked up whatever they owned, and they murdered their neighbors, their friends, and family members. The most consequential outcome, I argue, of the genocide is that the government successfully enjoined average citizens in this brutal horror, demonstrating it is possible for genocide planners, or genocidaires, to coerce a population into mass killing, using, I contend, well-established propaganda techniques and easily procured communications technology. Consequently, a conclusion one can draw is the array of technological capabilities that can be leveraged in the active recruitment of ordinary citizens increases the potential scale of genocide killings by an order of magnitude possibly unseen since the Holocaust. Simply put, how could so many ordinary people go about and conduct such horrific and killings in such an intimate manner? Obviously, the answer is multifaceted. However, setting aside the undeniable facts that there are many reasons, economic, political, cultural, social, that conspired to produce the genocide, the conduct of the genocide is directly attributable to the technology of genocide, which are, I maintain, propaganda, technique, and technology. Since the 20th century, how genocide produces death relies increasingly on these products. The modern genocide project, that is the genocide operation, really does consist of technique necessary to persuade, to justify, and to absolve guilt. The technology instrument itself consists of devices and platforms. In the 20th century, radio and the printing press served up propaganda in newspapers, journals, radio, and TV. In the 20th century, internet and social media and Facebook and the like conspired to also produce narratives and disseminate them. The case between propaganda technology requires a framework that understands the history of propaganda cannot be decoupled from that of technology, and that genocide, and appreciates the social and political impact of their union. In reality, there is just no one framework that does this. Rather, one must be newly constructed by several using individual disciplines that illuminate their respective domains. I rely particularly on the frameworks produced by Jacques Ellul, propaganda specialist and noted scholar on the technological society. I also consult Sheila Jasanoff and the co-production of technology. I consult Hannah Arendt, who demonstrated ordinary people do evil. And finally, Clausewitz, of course, on war. Collectively, these frameworks allow me to interrogate the complex arrangement of social, cultural, political, and economic variables that combust into genocide. These frameworks also give me a lexicon to describe the relationship of each independently and each together. Again, this is because, in essence, war and genocide produce the same outcome, death, although how each comes to do this differs. Genocide in the modern era is not a new phenomenon. What is new is the degree of civilian participation facilitated by commonly accessed technology and access to specialized knowledge. My research shows the rise of communications technology during the 20th century altered the character of genocide from a purely or mostly state-produced atrocity to a co-produced event exemplified by the sharing of responsibility with ordinary civilians in the actual killings. It's not that in the past, ordinary civilians have not also contributed to the killings. It is that in the case of the Rwandan genocide, scores upon thousands were enjoined. Although historically, the state has relied, again, on what I call non-state actors, individuals such as political groups, churches, and private militias to carry out these subordinate tasks, it's in recent years, for instance, that NSAs such as ISIS have conducted their own slaughter campaigns with the same degree of impunity seen by past state perpetrators. So my research demonstrates, my research of the 94 genocide, Rwanda genocide, demonstrates that the democratization of technology, that is the access to technology, really did induce an order of magnitude that might not otherwise have been witnessed. I've also noticed that there is a dearth of scholarship focused on the role of technology and propaganda in genocide. What tends to be the case is that propaganda is treated as a subordinate role in the exercise and the conduct of genocide. And I maintain that without propaganda, as Jacques Ellul maintained, to position the society and the individuals ready to do the work and then to absolve them of the guilt once the work is done, that it becomes very difficult to recruit the number of individuals necessary for these modern genocides to occur, always unfortunately. This is not to suggest that either propaganda or technology haven't already received focused attention. Again, it's that the treatment of these as props relegated to a supporting role conditions scholars and the rest of us to underestimate their paramountcy. For instance, Michael Mann, conception of power networks, military, economics, politics, and ideology. in the context of providing a rationale for genocide is accurate, but it might be more potent were to consider a fifth factor: technology, technique, the technique of propaganda. What the examples of Rwanda and recently ISIS show us is that technology really is bidirectional. End users appropriate technology and may co-produce events, just as the state did once upon a time. There is no doubt that today's technology offers would-be genocide perpetrators an opportunity to spread disinformation on a massive scale, on a global international scale, and that the masses might consider this message to be legitimate. Given that artificial intelligence is already in flux, we must ask ourselves what the risks of amplifying future genocides are if we fail to pay attention to propaganda, or the role that propaganda technology play. This is an urgent issue, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Outstanding, Claudia. Thank you. That's your first academic presentation. You are a natural, exemplary. And I imagine we're going to have a lot of questions, because especially in the time in which we're living, technology and propaganda, very timely topic. So our second speaker is again Christopher Harrison of NAU, and he will be once again speaking on the mechanisms of genocidal conscription. And I will turn the floor over to you, or I guess the screen to you, Christopher.
Thank you very much. Let me get going with my presentation. Can everyone see this PowerPoint here? Is that coming through good? Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present my study here. This is a derivative of my dissertation, which is titled Genocidal Conscription. I'm just going to get started by giving you a brief outline of the work. I've got an introduction. I'm going to go through the concepts I look at. And the emphasis here is to ask a particular question, whether or not we actually have some of the overlapping concerns for the intersectional concepts of war and genocide through the institution of conscription and the definition of conscription, mandatory military service. But I'll go through a little bit more of those details with my literature review, looking at some of the views that scholars have had on these terms. I'm also going to give you a little bit of framework in the theory that I'm looking at in terms of these mechanisms, and also a little bit on the method, but that might be best left till Q&A if you're interested in the methodology. It's interdisciplinary comparative. And then I have two particular cases that I focus in on with my study. First, Ottoman Armenian conscripts, and then also Jewish Hungarian conscripts. And I'm going to also present a table of the summary of my findings, and that will help illustrate those mechanisms more clearly, as well as a brief conclusion. So what are these concepts, right? So war, as we know, international conflict, as long as all of human history, in essence, everything documented since the first settlements, we have all sorts of very interesting events with warfare, and so too is genocide. Acts of ancient genocide, cases that continue through into the modern age, and even contemporary cases. Yet, interestingly enough, there's been an effort to somehow divide these modes of destruction. And it's only very recently that scholars are actually recognizing that they interact, they intersect, and that there are these overlapping concerns. And my focus is on this institution of mandatory military service, conscription. Now, that does take place outside of combat. It can extend into forced labor and other issues, including even differences among tax burdens in terms of military service, and then service to the state from the civilian population through exemptions of military service. But there is this gap in the literature that I'm very interested in looking into in more detail, because my question here, it is something of a simplistic yes or no. Have such states, genocidal states, actually utilized conscription, which we see in terms of warfare, sending people off to war, the very risky, dangerous, and deadly environments of warfare, could this well be actually some aspect of a tool of genocide, especially within the institutions of genocidal states? And my argument is that yes, we've seen this as a subversion of the institution of conscription. And when we look at this in the context of two particular cases, it can actually help us predict some elements in terms of contemporary cases and perhaps issues in the future. So when we look at the literature review on conscription, very often in the modern nation context, we talk about the French Revolution onwards, works including those by Alan Forrest, and also another scholar I'd like to point you to in the direction of, that being William Philpott. And Philpott's work looked at something of a change that took place in World War I, where hundreds of thousands of conscripts, very much mass standing armies, sent off to war. But there's no real question as to, well, what's the intent of the state if this goes on for years? Hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of conscripts die in warfare. What else might be going on? Well, in the genocide scholarship, we see a couple of references to forced labor. This stems largely because of Raphael Lemkin's work on the Axis-occupied Europe era during World War II, and indeed his term coining the phrase genocide. In that work, he looked at the use of forced labor in conscription policies. So, however, it's more descriptive. It's not necessarily an analytical viewpoint. And so a couple of other works, including that by works looking at forced labor by Wolf Gruner and also R.J. Rummel. Again, it's descriptive. We don't actually have any form of analysis. Examining the definition, as we are all aware, looking at the crime of genocide itself from the United Nations, this is more down to these issues that I focus on, the first three clauses: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily and mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions, specifically to reduce that group identified by nation, ethnicity, race, or religion, in whole or in part. And the in part issue is crucial to this particular effort to recognize the potential misuse and subversion of the institution of conscription to commit genocide. So my theoretical framework first looks at this issue brought on into focus by the work of Prussian military strategist Karl von Clausewitz in terms of this concept of wastage in war. And the idea here is not a derogatory term, it's to explain the losses of warfare, those people killed or injured, and even the destruction of property in war. And so by World War I, we have this normalization where states willingly accept many losses in warfare. And just to point you into the use of this term, as very often the phrase states used to describe losses by World War I, especially conscripted losses, this was the term wastage. People were using this in terms of policy, in terms of explanation of mass losses. I contribute this phrase genocide by wastage. And so instead of simply recognizing losses accepted, maybe even expected in future combat, what about when a state is actually using the guise of warfare and those losses to send specific conscripts into the deadly environments of war? And so I have this additional concept of genocide by wastage, using warfare to kill off particular members of a targeted population group. The mechanisms I examine come from an aspect of comparative analysis, first put down by Eric Marcuson, in terms of mechanisms that show the connections between warfare and genocide. And so we're looking at these issues of divisions amongst social groups, isolation of a particular targeted population, subordination under the command of perpetrators. Then these relocation efforts to send people off into the deadly environments of warfare and acts of destruction. I have these illustrations to assist with just fleshing out some of these ideas for you in terms of the theoretical viewpoint. In essence, we're looking at a state that is an in-group, and it selectively conscripts members that then become out-group conscripts. Now, that's not to say there's not other conscripts. There are, and I'll get into that in my findings, but it's more down to the subordination process that takes place with an out-group target population of conscripts under the command of an in-group. And then this leads to the deployment to serve wastage roles, those roles in which lives are lost and losses are incurred. However, in terms of that first framework, that's similar to what we might expect in warfare. There's going to be losses in warfare. However, this last step, I'd like to point you to notice this last step. What about when there's evidence of massacres? What about when the outgroup of the conscripts actually are victims of massacres perpetrated by the in-group? Then we have to ask about that line in which we might not be looking at warfare anymore, but instead we're looking at cases of genocide. Very briefly, in terms of my method, because I didn't want to get to my findings before I'm out of time. Use an interdisciplinary comparative method, political science concepts of scholars including Theda Skocpol, Margaret Somers, in terms of parallel tracing, comparative analysis, more than one case, and also empirical historical observations, and as I said, the mechanisms as first put up by Eric Markuson. So using two cases actually allows a comparison where the differences do not undermine the theory, but instead actually strengthen the recognition of repeating aspects. And that therefore provides us with this predictive capacity that might actually point to potential prevention measures in issues and cases today, as well as into the future. The cases I looked at are the experiences of Armenian Ottoman conscripts of World War I, Jewish Hungarian conscripts of World War II. As we know, these are well-documented cases of genocide, and they are also cases that take place during major wars, in which the policy, the institution of conscription, was in large and universally applied policy. So let me take you through a couple of details of my findings very quickly. The mechanisms here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the very significant mechanism that I point out is subordination. As you can see, I analyzed for a variety of different groups in my cases to demonstrate the differences across these particular population groups. When we get to the significant issue of who was disarmed during the war as a conscript, we see here that alongside evidence of massacres, in particular, Armenians were, in my argument, victims of genocide by wastage, whereas other groups, it's either unknown because I just have not necessarily completed that research, it's potential for future research, or we have this issue of wastage of warfare, the ordinary expected losses of warfare. And I know I have under a minute to go, so let me wrap up real quick. In terms of my conclusion, I suggest that subordination is an aspect that we might use as a way to prevent these issues when we have multi-ethnic populations and these issues, questions of whether or not there are abuses, discrimination, maybe even this question of genocide, and that there are concerns in terms of contemporary cases, especially in a range of nation states in the Islamic world, in which you might want to read up on the work of Daniel Pipes, who's actually looked at this issue of slave soldiers, conscription, and this use of particularly minority population groups in this method that normalizes the losses of warfare. And perhaps there's this issue where we might even see this line crossed in terms of genocide or conscription. Thank you very much, and I'm willing to take questions later on. I will hand it back over to Tim.
All right, thank you, Christopher. Lots of questions for the first two presenters. So our third presenter is Sina Meisgeier from, again, double PhD candidate from University of Arizona and University of Leipzig. And again, the topic of her presentation is Hegemonic Relationships, Female Characters in German Memoirs about the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And I will turn the screen over to you, Sina.
Thank you. It is an honor to be invited to this graduate student panel and to represent the University of Arizona in the 9th edition of Genocide Awareness Week. The University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. In the next 10 minutes, I will provide an insight into my dissertation research. I will specifically focus on the overarching argument and how it challenges the binary view of concentration camp victim versus Nazi perpetrator. I will also discuss why it is important to look at Holocaust literature to reveal discourses about the post-war period and about former East and West Germany. In my dissertation project, I'm examining how German-speaking communists, German Jewish women, and so-called asocial and criminal prisoners are portrayed in selected texts written solely by women and in German. The writings at the heart of my project were produced by Ravensbrück survivors. Some of them worked as prisoner functionaries, and also secondary witnesses, and all these writings were produced between the end of World War II and the late 1980s. These texts exist on the verge between the factual and the fictional. They range from diary entries to memoirs, and these genres are also known in the field of literary studies as life writing. On the more fictional end, I'm analyzing a biography, a short narrative, a theater play, and 2 novels. All of these works have been published. However, during my research stay at the Ravensbrück archive last year, I discovered 2 unpublished novels from the 1970s that became incredibly relevant for my work. Unfortunately, there won't be enough time for me to introduce you to all of these works and the women behind them, but I will make some references, and I'm happy to answer specific questions during the Q&A. Overarchingly, I argue that these Holocaust texts do not portray camp prisoners as mere victims in a victim-perpetrator dichotomy, nor as a group of women who showed absolute solidarity towards each other. Rather, hegemonic relationships developed within the prisoner community, which excluded some individuals and groups, while others gained privileges and power. The more privileged groups often used the same forced stereotyping as the Nazis did. And I quote Jack Morrison here, "The Nazis' own prejudices were being adopted by the prisoners themselves, as many viewed the asocials as lazy, corrupt, filthy, and generally despicable." End of quote. The camp experiences of so-called asocial and criminal prisoners have been marginalized throughout the decades, and there are barely any primary sources about them available. This has been the case for male prisoners, as shown by Frank Nonnenmacher, and even more so when we look at women, and Helga Ammersberger and her colleagues did really relevant work there. So not only has there existed a hierarchy between male and female Holocaust experiences, but also among prisoner groups and how they are remembered. It was not until February of 2020 that these prisoners were even recognized as a group of victims of the Nazis. This was preceded by political discussions in the German parliament as to whether there might have been people rightfully imprisoned in a concentration camp. The literary portrayal of the atrocity that took place in camps such as Ravensbrück reflects socio-historical discourses, because whenever people put memories into a written form, these memories turn into narrations, projections, and ultimately into negotiations of power. And this is how the Austrian survivor Lotte Dorowin-Zeisel puts it, and I quote, "When you watch films or hear testimonies, you think that all prisoners were just a uniform crowd. Actually, the living conditions were very, very different. And the question of survival also depended on the category. Of course, the political prisoners with the red triangles somehow formed an elite, especially the German speakers." End of quote. And these are my translations from the German. This statement refers to the violent actions of the Nazis, who classified prisoners based on the triangle colors, forcing them to give up their multifaceted identities and be placed in a rigorous top-down system. The top-down force in the camps, as investigated, for example, by Wolfgang Sowski, undeniably came from the ruling SS and the female guards. And I agree with Hannah Arendt that, and I quote, The concentration camps are the most consequential institution of totalitarian rule. So somewhat seamlessly, the notion of Nazi equals evil perpetrator and inmate equals virtuous victim developed out of this premise, and it shaped the discourse about the Holocaust for decades. In her recent article on female prisoner functionaries, Andrea Rudolph states, and I quote, "Sofsky's monolithic and static model of absolute power, which left little room for an analysis of changing social patterns, of variations and flexibility of structures within concentration camp society, influenced the scholarly discourse." Before I conclude, I would like to provide two literary examples of the dynamics within the prisoner society and the subversion of the victim-perpetrator binary. The first example is taken from Ruth Werner's biography about Olga Benario from 1961. It was a bestseller in the GDR. The Jewish identity of Benario is concealed by her portrayal as a fiery communist. And in her position as the block eldest in the Jewish barrack, she feels morally superior and approaches the prisoners in a highly problematic way. And before I read the quote, this is Ruth Werner's interpretation of Olga Benario. And yeah, highly problematic. So here's the quote. "In the evening, Olga had an approximate overview. In the tightly packed cubicles of the yellow barrack were almost exclusively Jewish criminals, thieves, sex criminals, prostitutes, drinkers. They lacked everything that set the political prisoners apart: the strength of a worldview, community spirit, discipline, the knowledge of why they were here, and the will to fight." End of quote. So this deeply discriminatory language, I think, might even remind us of the Nazis' worldview themselves, who also valued discipline, community spirit, in their own horrible understanding, of course. The second example is from Anja Lundholm's novel Das Höllentor, The Gates of Hell, from 1988. In the novel, some inmates question their subjective role in the Nazis' apparatus of power. In the following short conversation, the protagonist Anja talks to her fellow inmate Bienhold. Both are political prisoners, and Bienhold reflects on her work in the infirmary. She was involved in forced sterilizations of Sinti and Roma inmates. And I quote, Anja, "But you had to do it. You didn't have a choice. They forced you." Bienhold, "I also believed that once. I know better now. I shouldn't have let myself be forced. The wire fence is a way out for extreme situations. I am guilty. Do you understand?" End of quote. Bienhold takes responsibility here for assisting the SS. She also shares with Anja that she saw a female guard die by suicide on the wire fence. So by describing this and by admitting having assisted in the genocide, the perpetrator-victim binary gets subverted. Some female guards become vulnerable, become human, at least their portrayal of them, while some inmates' virtuousness is questioned by themselves or by their peers. In both literary examples, the readers are confronted with, and I quote Rudolph here again, moral ambiguities in the camp system. I hope that these aspects will be further discussed, and I also hope that my dissertation will contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sina, for that fascinating presentation on Ravensbrück. All right, our fourth and final graduate student panelist is ASU's Mark Vance, who will be speaking of rescue of Jews in Vichy, France. So, Mark, the screen is yours.
Thank you. You guys can all see this, yes? All right. Thank you all for joining. Just a quick apology. I've come down with a bit of a head cold, so if I sneeze or cough at all, I apologize in advance. So the title of my research is Resilience, Rescue, and Resistance, the History of the Lowy Family in Vichy. The topics that I wanted to explore was the experience of a Jewish family during World War II and the Holocaust, as well as the trials of survival, resilience, and resistance in France and Vichy. The questions I wanted to explore were how the Lowy's experience mirror or differs from the Jewish experience between 1939 and 1946, as well as the experience of Jews participating in passive and active resistance during World War II. And I used the Lowy's as a navigator through my research, sharing their experience in contrast to experience of other Jews in different locations and time periods. This research would not have happened without the help of Dr. Lawrence Bell in the Arizona Jewish Historical Society, Michael Levine and the Barleycorn Board, and the National World War II Museum. So a little background information on the family. Elias and Bertha were both born in Galicia, Galicia region of Poland, before the turn of the 20th century. Both moved to Frankfurt, Germany at different times, Bertha in 1900 and Elias in 1917, but met in 1918 after Elias took a job working for Bertha's father, and they both married in 1919. They had 3 children, Erna in 1920, Max in 1922, and Fred in 1925. Excuse me. A year after Fred's birth, Elias took a job at a metal recycling plant in Célestat, France, in the Alsace region. Following a short stint at the recycling plant, Elias began to endeavor on his own by starting a radio business in Colmar, France. The Lowy's enjoyed success until things began heating up in Germany, and this drove Elias and the boys to join the French Civil Defense, a decision that would prove to become valuable for the safety of the family. So Germany began its invasion in May 1940, but did not reach the Alsace-Lorraine region until June. When it became apparent that they were going to be overran, Elias requested a train ticket from the Civil Defense to get out, and the family eventually made it to Bordeaux, but after the armistice was already signed. The armistice split France into two, between the occupied region in the north and the unoccupied region of the south. With news getting out, the Lowy's made their way to the city of Toulouse, which became a refugee center for displaced peoples. While the Lowy's were making home in Toulouse, the new Vichy government began creating a number of anti-Jewish measures. These laws were created by the Vichy government without the help of Germany, as Germany played mostly hands-off with the collaborative government. Excuse me. The laws created a legal standing for who was considered Jewish through lineage. It also stripped Jews of their jobs in education and the government, as well as stripped French citizenship from any Jew who had arrived in France by 1936. On October 3rd, Vichy enacted its first laws concerning the status of Jews, followed by its internment measures on October 4th. In the middle of the night in November, the Lowy's were arrested by French police officers and sent to an internment camp known as Camp d'Agde on the southern coast of France. Originally built as a refugee camp for the Spanish Civil War refugees, the Vichy government turned the area into an internment camp for Jews as well as foreign nationals. Conditions at the camp were deplorable. When arriving at the camp, families were separated amongst men, women, and children. Each internee was given a layer of straw and a single blanket. Each barrack housed up to 40 people, with no heat for the men and heating only up until 6 p.m. for the women and children. This became a massive issue in the winters of southern France, where temperatures would reach below freezing. Fat and protein were also severely lacking with food, which contained mostly boiled water or broth. And for those who were kosher, they had no other options. Hygiene was also an issue, with evidence of rodents making their home in the barracks as well as the sleeping areas. Water was also in short supply, with many going days without showers or baths. Any sort of infraction, which could be nearly anything, was also met with severe beatings by camp officials, as well as being segregated in jailings for long periods. Something that also differs from these early internment camps versus the concentration camps was the privileged internees were able to leave the camp during certain portions of the day with permission. The Lowy's were able to gain that permission after befriending a camp commander, and about 2 weeks into being in the camp, Elias and Erna were able to leave and go to the city of Montpellier, where Elias hoped to find a way to escape. Excuse me. Unbeknownst to him, the gentleman who gave him the job at the metal recycling center was at City Hall. Following a conversation, it became known that the gentleman, Camille Ernst, was the Secretary General of the Prefect, placing him second command as well as in charge of the police force. Ernst granted the family their release with an order and requested that the family stay in Montpellier to help rescue others like them. So one of the loopholes in the statute was that if a family had the means to live without being a strain on the French state, they were given their release. The family and Ernst compiled a list of the more well-off internees and rescued them first with that in mind. In return, the rescued families had to give the Loeys money that they would clean with the help of local businesses and brought the money back into the camp for the next family. So essentially, the family was running a money laundering scheme to help rescue internees. Over a several-month period, the family rescued around 1,500 people, as well as were able to get 200 out of France through Portugal and Africa. While some family members were working on cleaning money and rescuing some others, other family members were building a network in the city of Montpellier. With the help of restaurants, businesses, civilians, Jewish scouts, the local Catholic church, and the local hospital, the family, along with Ernst, were able to give those rescues the provisions they needed. The Catholic Church also provided false papers for those who were able to escape France altogether. Eventually, Vichy and Germany caught on to what was going on and closed down Camp des Agdes, transferring all internees to Rivesaltes Camp and eventually Drancy. It was also became known that Elias and the family were now enemies of the state, according to the Gestapo, and the family were given false papers by the Catholic Church and ran to the Lozères Mountains in central part of Vichy. While in the Lozères from 1942 to 1945, the two boys joined the local French resistance, participating in a number of battles and helping with the invasion of southern France by the Allies. One such battle took place in August 1944 outside of the town of Alès, which was a major transportation hub that connected the north and the south. Reports came in that retreating Germans were attempting to link up with others who were trying to make their way back into Germany. Fred's and Max's group were tasked with preventing that. Following a several-hour battle outside of the town, the small 170-person unit was able to kill or capture 2,000 Germans. Sadly, Max would become the unit's only casualty in the battle, as he was killed by a mortar shell in the fray. Elias continued his work with local networks to help others escape Vichy, using local resistance groups and Jewish organizations. It is ultimately unknown just how many others Elias helped rescue while in the mountains. However, Elias continued his work after the liberation, working with local Jewish organizations as well as the World Jewish Congress to help displaced Jews regain their business and property, either through monetary ways or physically removing squatters. When the dust settled in Europe, Elias received the news that only he and his sister were the only ones alive in his family, as his mother, father, and siblings and cousins had all been killed in Poland. The legacy of family is seen in their migration to the United States. The family was originally denied French citizenship due to, quote, not being assimilated enough, but were able to get tickets to the United States. This was due to an American officer who had heard of the work Elias had done. The officer, Major Sol Leland, was a part of a unit that liberated a camp in Austria. In that camp, Major Leland came across an orphaned boy whose family was killed in the camp. Excuse me. Major Leland asked Elias if he would take the boy to the United States, where he hoped to adopt the boy following his deployment. This is how the family was able to get to the United States, where the young boy, Jacob, still lives today in New York as a psychologist. Following a short stint in New York, the family moved to Phoenix in the 1950s, where Elias worked with local Orthodox Jews in the city to help build the city's first Orthodox synagogue, which still sits unused today in downtown Phoenix off of Portland Ave. The Loeys showed us another aspect of the Holocaust, notably one of the lesser-known portions of it. Vichy participated heavily in the final solution, especially after 1942. In total, Vichy's camps and their role led to the death of thousands of Jews. In 1942, Ernst was captured by German officials and sent to Buchenwald, where he barely survived his 3 years there. The work of the Loeys and Ernst gained some attention. Ernst was also awarded the Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Site in Jerusalem. And the Loeys story was saved by Fred, who donated all his family's belongings and files to the Arizona Jewish Historical Society, as well as local advocates who fought to save the site of the synagogue, which played a significant role in the growth of Phoenix becoming the home for Jews, Mexican Americans, and the Black Theater Troupe, until becoming the site of the city's homeless in 2001. Today, the site is being brought back to its original status as a synagogue, with the hopes of becoming a site of remembrance. Thank you so much for attending today.
All right, thank you for your outstanding presentations. For the excellent graduate students we have here in Arizona, and I like the local angle ending, which we ended. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and already generously our panelists have preemptively responded. So maybe I will read out the question for everyone and Christopher and Claudia, if you don't mind reiterating your answers spoken, so you can speak for yourselves rather than me reading your responses. So Eddie Zilber asked the first question. Eddie stated and asked, there are writings describing strategies in the 19th century where the Tsar conscripted involuntarily Jewish boys for 25 years. Most did not survive. Many who survived forgot they were Jewish, and some served on the front line and were killed. Is this what you mean by wastage? So, Christopher, would you like to respond to that? And you can just, if you want, you can just read what you wrote, or if you want to expand
All
on
right.
how you responded. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's really fascinating. There are all sorts of examples of groups being taken from one place, one community to another. The Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, another group we might have heard of. I actually haven't heard of this case myself, but what I've looked at is this distinction where we could maybe draw some lines and make that delineation between combat losses incurred in war, because that's the signal, that's the excuse that denialist states use. Oh, this is just warfare, these are losses, right? So this concept of wastage is Clausewitz's term to say losses in war. And I'm saying, okay, yes, but then what about if you do it on purpose, if there's an intent to destroy particular conscripts, therefore genocide by wastage. So I'd have to look at this issue of the Cantonists in Tsarist Russia to really talk about that in more detail, because I just don't know. But it's fascinating that you do see time and time again. Now, the Janissaries, the example I gave, actually ended up in elite force positions, commanders even to the court for the empire, for the Ottoman Empire. So it's this question as to, do you have subordination? And that's a real key factor. And then do you also see massacres of disarmed conscripts that are killed off during warfare? Because then that's that issue in terms of the obfuscation, the excuse, the cover story, the guise of losses incurred in warfare. And so just using the theory and those mechanisms I was explaining helps us just kind of pick apart and demonstrate where that line gets crossed between war and genocide. But thank you very much for the question. Appreciate it.
Yes, it's an interesting question, war and genocide, degenerative warfare, and such. It's an important topic. We have a question for Claudia, which Claudia's got a bit of a fan club here, and also a very important question that came to mind and that Claudia generously answered, and I'll ask you to speak to this, but Maud Bazil asked, if technology made ordinary people commit genocide, how can technology help to make it not repeat?
So thank you for the question. And just a slight clarification. So technology doesn't cause people to commit genocide. My thesis is that propaganda it sits inside the environment, and people sit inside a propagandized environment for a very long time, as Jacques Ellul demonstrated. And this simmering, one's motivations are influenced. Technology then assists in the implementation of the genocide, such that it is able to expand what might be just a few murders into the scale that we talk about. And how could we all as a society imagine doing something about it? I believe, quite frankly, we treat technology and genocide, or the tools of genocide, the way we do any other technology that we believe can cause harm. We inform, we train, we teach, and we regulate. And so this is not to say that, oh my goodness, nobody's going to have television anymore, but it is to say that what happens on television, what happens on the internet matters. Words matter, and as we learned earlier this week, words kill. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask something along that line too, Claudia, while we have you here. Alexander Laban Hinton's book just came out in an e-version. Its print is going to come out in June. It's his new book, It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Threat of Genocide in the US. And we saw January 6th, and we've got some technology and propaganda issues in this country right now. Would you mind speaking to that?
I believe, unfortunately, that what's happening today is part of the same continuum of this long century of genocide. So while we are in the 21st century, when we do study modern genocide, and we understand that modern genocide is a function of the tools and techniques that create murder on this scale, then what we're experiencing today, I think, is similar. It would be hard to say otherwise. We have replaced ethnicity with a construct of political party. I can't tell by looking at you, Dr. Langille, what party you are, but imagine that I could. Imagine that artificial intelligence could tell a genocide planner exactly where you lived and what your routine is. What we're talking about really is a potential for harm that certainly this nation hasn't seen on the scale since the Civil War. But I personally and unfortunately do believe that the underlying tensions and the environmental conditions are there.
Yeah, and I have not read his book yet, but I do want to take a look at that. I think it's an important topic. Are there other questions or panelists? Do you want to, we got, it's almost 2. We can go to around 2:15. I got an announcement to make at the end if so I invite the audience to send in some more questions. Oh, I think maybe we got another one, or panelists, if you'd like to respond to each other.
Yeah.
Another one just came in.
Yes, I'm trying to. Right. Oh, Joella Jacobs asks, thank you for your excellent presentations. I echo that. Given our conversation about language, how can literature counteract propaganda? This question probably goes to both Sina and Claudia. Sina, you have not responded in the Q&A yet. Would you like to start this?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think difficult to answer because, and that's something that I've dealt with in my research on Ravensbrück, especially when I look at texts that were published in former East Germany. Some of the Ravensbrück literature that was published in the GDR was also used as propaganda to propagate the communist resistance. So I think literature can go both ways, right? It can reveal issues, and reveal genocidal actions and be self-reflective about them, but on the other hand can also deepen or be a tool for propaganda even. So these are my thoughts. Maybe Claudia, you have a little bit more to say on that, and maybe then I can come back with a few more thoughts.
So you're absolutely right. And for me, literature is just one medium of propaganda, right? So propaganda, these days we're a highly visual society. So literature takes the form of comic books. It takes the form of well, that's the one that I'm thinking of best. But so literature has changed modalities. So I think really propaganda, if we go back to classical times, it's heated rhetoric. Fundamentally, it's heated rhetoric, and heated rhetoric can either bring people together and we can all defend ourselves when necessary, and then of course it can break people apart. And literature, I think, is just in a really evocative way. It's a story, right? I mean, history is a story. And so literature is just one more modality that evildoers have used to essentially proliferate genocide.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that also the literature and the texts that have been published and haven't been published, there's also a huge power there, because who gets to decide what has been published or what is going to get published and what and whatnot. So that's also something with my work on Ravensbrück and its narrative in the GDR, that the two unpublished novels I discovered, they go strongly against a pure communist resistance narrative, and even discuss the German Jewish activity in Ravensbrück camp, or put a so-called asocial protagonist in the text, but it hasn't been published. So there's power and control there too. But I also think that literature can be a tool to teach people to become more critical thinkers, and that's something I'm trying to do in my teaching too, to present my students with texts and or other modalities like videos or just different contents, and have them ask questions and look behind what's presented there. So I think there's also a huge anti-propaganda power in reading literature and yeah, diving into it.
Yep.
You can continue if you'd like, Claudia, if you got.
Oh, no, I was just mouthing ditto. That's right. No, just that literature. I mean, I think I recall when I first read Catcher in the Rye. I still do. So literature can be really transcendental for a lot of us, not just the geeky ones that study history, but just everybody. And so yeah, I think you can see this in our current paradigm of just this desire to talk about, for instance, disinformation or misinformation, and it's starting to enter all the different private communities. But it's funny how everybody interacts with the message differently. And so that's, I think, the richness as historians we all get to do, and that's kind of what that I was able to appreciate myself in listening to my colleagues talk about their research.
Excellent. And Sina, I'll ask you with, you just referred to your class, if you were so generous to share your syllabus on fascism and resistance, I'd love to see that. That sounds like a fascinating class. Still got a few minutes. Mark, how did you get interested in the Lowy family? I found this fascinating, and I love the scale of this panel, like its diversity and the topics covered and the local angle we got. So what brought you to this research? It's a very fascinating story, and someone relatively new to Phoenix, I'm learning a bit more about Phoenix Jewish history, and I found this very intriguing.
Yeah, it to be honest with you, it was actually just kind of a stroke of luck, which if you've kind of seen from this story of the Lowies, a lot of it, their survival and resilience was luck. I just presented myself to a colleague, Dr. Volker Ben-Kurt. I said, I'm interested in the Holocaust, I'm interested in World War II. And he said, oh, perfect, I have this synagogue who's trying to be, or is in the process of being rebuilt to its original status. And we need to know the history of it. And so I kind of jumped onto the team, started doing research at the Arizona Historical Society, translating the documents from French and German, and it kind of blew into this bigger story than we thought it really was. We kind of knew that the family were Holocaust survivors, but we didn't realize actually how deep it went into as far as their rescue of others, like I said, 1,500 other Jews, as they're part of the resistance, the work that they did after liberation, and then the work that they continued in Phoenix as well to kind of build up the Jewish community in the 1950s.
Okay. Yeah, Volker Bankert, he's a transformative figure. He's a colleague who's influenced me in some great ways as well. So do we have other questions from the audience or for each other before, because we've got to wrap it up in a maximum about 8 minutes, but we can end this here if we need to. All right, well, let's give a virtual round of applause for our fantastic graduate panel here and for each other. Excellent job, and Mark, I hope you feel better, and it was great meeting you all virtually, and I'm going to make an announcement about 2022. Thank you for participating in Genocide Awareness Week this year. In 2022, Genocide Awareness Week will be moving to Arizona State University, where it will become a joint project with Northern Arizona University and the University of Arizona. So this is what's wonderful about this graduate panel. It reflects the future direction of Genocide Awareness Week, which is very exciting. And you can see the excellent graduate students we have and the collaboration, and we still got the John Lifferton Foundation we're going to build on. So we are in excellent hands. So we hope to see you in April 2022 as we continue our commitment to education about the Holocaust and other genocides. Thank you for your interest and support. And also, finally, excitingly, we have our keynote next year. We know will be, we're still finalizing some speakers, and we got an excellent lineup, but our keynote will be Father Patrick Dubois, Holocaust by Bullets, and he will be speaking on April 4th as our keynote. So we're very excited to be working together, faculty at, we got Alex Alvarez from NAU, we've got a couple professors from U of A, Gil Ryback and Lindsay Montgomery, and we've got our ASU people, and John Lifferton's working with us because John has just done such fantastic work. This is Genocide Awareness Week 9, right? And what he has done and built at Scottsdale Community College, and what he is bringing to us, and that we're making this an Arizona, a pan-Arizona thing is so exciting. And, so I'd also like to give applause to, even though we still have one more day tomorrow with the education workshop, but John Lifferton deserves a round of applause. What his Heraclean efforts over the last 9 years, and what he is, this is the biggest genocide conference in North America, and we're going to make it the biggest in the world. And it's exciting, and we're going to be working together in Arizona with this. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you after giving you applause for everything you have done and the foundation and what you're passing on to us. It's such a great gift.
Well, thank you very much. And I know it's going to be in good hands at ASU with all our colleagues and throughout the state and across the country, because we're going to continue to work with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, with the Shoah Foundation, the ADL, Southern Poverty Law Center, the FBI, numerous organizations that we've worked with before, Armenians, of course, the Assyrians, the Bosnians with whom we work. We have such a group together to make this truly the preeminent conference in the world, which I truly believe it will be no later than 2024, perhaps in 2023, but by 2024, it'll be on everybody's mind all over the world when they come to think about genocide and education and such. Speaking of education, though, we do have one more thing going on tomorrow. It starts at 9 a.m. in the morning. Our incredible resident of Arizona, Kim Klett, will be giving a workshop through Echoes and Reflections and the ADL, 2 separate workshops than we've ever had before. That's one of the things I've learned through doing this over the years, is you have to have variety. You can't have the same, it can't be a trench deeply dug. And so Kim's coming in and she's giving 2 workshop presentations tomorrow. The first one for 3 hours, and then there's a little break, and then there's another one for 3 hours. And teachers can get professional growth for this as well. And that will be very important in the future, because when Arizona does finally vote in this mandatory education for teaching the Holocaust and genocide, the districts will be looking for qualified people. And that is forthcoming. So again, I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you very much. I feel like we are in good hands with this caliber of graduate students, and I look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a very nice evening and a good weekend. And be safe, please.
Thank you.